Modern scholars caution that madness was a label used to justify regency and seizure of power. Joanna's tragedy was partly real, partly convenient for those who would seize the levers of state. Her legacy is a warning about diagnostic language used as a cloak for political dispossession. Catherine the Great enters primarily as an epilogue here, a later, safer sort of scandal magnet. She is a figure who lived with an enormous appetite for self-fashioning, and at her death carried the ambiguous badge that scandal loves: brilliance, ambition, and tales that do not survive close scrutiny. A persistent rumor claimed outrageously intimate improprieties. Modern scholars reject the most salacious stories as late libel and voyeuristic fantasy. But the persistence of those rumors reveals less about Catherine's bedside and more about how later generations used sexual slander as a way to minimize female authority. Fredegund, remember the kind of queen who could be both a ruthless actor and a woman stuck in constant defensive mode. Fredegund is associated with a culture of vengeance and retribution. She appears in sources as violent, yes, but also as someone who was navigating royal infancy, factional plots, and a male-dominated succession system where killing could be political arithmetic. The story of Fredegund suggests that when women took violent measures, chroniclers often read them as moral failures rather than political strategies. Anne Boleyn, the courtly woman who turned the English court into a theater of religion, sex, and succession. Anne's story is intimately familiar: an intelligent, cultured woman whose presence at Henry VIII's side eventually cost her head. The allegations against Anne, adultery, incest, treason, were serious and public. But historians note how conveniently those charges resolved a political dilemma. When a king's will conflicted with institutional norms, the court needed a scapegoat. Contemporary sources vary. Some depict Anne as arrogant, others as clever and charismatic. Modern scholarship tends to read her as a political actor caught in a whirlwind of royal obsession, ecclesiastical rupture, and factional ambition. The way the charges were orchestrated, testimonial witnesses, confessions obtained under pressure, suggests that law was being used as theater. Anne's legacy is both martyr and manipulator, depending on which chorus of voices you hear. Christina of Denmark, a policymaker disguised in silk. Christina's life is a reminder that marriage markets were politics, and that queens sometimes used reputation, poetry, and cultivated persona as currency. When we read of her flirtations and diplomatic letters, what we must hear is the social grammar of a queen who could use charm like coins in a market where lineage and alliances mattered more than personal affection. Maria of Portugal and Olga of Kiev introduce geographic breadth. Maria's story shows how Iberian courts negotiated identity, faith, and succession. Olga of Kiev's narrative carries different timbres. Here, the image of a woman who could order revenge and build institutions resonates. The famous stories of punitive ingenuity are part of a pattern where a ruler used spectacle to create deterrence and memory. The tales about Olga, some heroic, some monstrous, must be read with a caution flag. The chroniclers who preserved them had their own moral and political ends. Lucrezia Borgia and the entire Borgia lore deserve special attention because they show how a family name can mutate into legend. Lucrezia's life is often reduced to whispers of incest, poison, and a political pawnhood. Yet archival evidence shows a more nuanced woman who cultivated literary salons, patronized artists, and negotiated marriages as political tools. A persistent rumor claimed her involvement in poisonings. Modern scholars are skeptical and note that her reputation was shaped by partisan rivals and later moralizers. Lucrezia's story asks us to separate the femme fatale trope from a woman who exercised influence in constrained ways and who patronized culture in a turbulent family environment. Wu Zetian and Tamar of Georgia extend the scale to empires where queenly power looked different but equally consequential. Wu Zetian rose to become emperor in China, a remarkable concentration of authority that generated both admiration and virulent contemporary criticism. Many accounts of Wu are colored by Confucian historians uneasy with her inversion of gendered order. Tamar of Georgia, praised in many sources, shows another curve. In some cultures, a powerful queen might be celebrated as founding glory. Both cases show that cultural scripts shape whether a woman's authority is named virtue or vice. Pause with me a moment. That string of names runs like beads on a rosary of reputation. Some admired, some accused, all instructive. What ties them together is not one anatomy of ambition, but the anatomy of rumor. How small domestic acts, a closed chamber, a lavish gift, a refusal, magnified into political stories that could topple ministers and tarnish dynasties. Rumor is not simply gossip, it is currency. It moves where documentation is thin, and it meets power where power is exposed. When a queen failed to conform to expectations, rumor arrived as a social sanction. Let's shift now from thrones to feasts, because festivals tell us why societies needed outlets for inversion. Imagine Christmas in the late medieval context. Not the sanitized holiday of modern postcards, but a long season of liturgical observance, feasting, mock authority, and disguised reversal. The 12 days of Christmas were a social ritual that let hierarchies bend briefly. There was noise, there were special foods, and there was licensed disorder. In many courts, gifts were tokens of alliance and obligation. A boar's head paraded into a hall was both spectacle and social currency. The Yule log, later a domestic custom, began as an outdoor bonfire that marked winter's heart, fire as both ritual warmth and symbolic rebirth. Trace it further back to Saturnalia, and you see the Roman prehistory of inversion. Saturnalia allowed masters and servants to swap roles, at least symbolically. Masks and costumes permitted people to speak otherwise unspoken truths. The Lord of Misrule, a figure installed during revels, functioned as a sanctioned troublemaker, a release valve to prevent unrest from accumulating. These customs mattered politically because they made space for collective catharsis. If you want to understand why a community tolerated extreme kingship the rest of the year, look at the calendars that permitted laughter and mockery for a few days. Ritual inversion is not simply fun, it is a social thermostat. Sensory detail matters here. A Saturnalian feast smelled of roasted meats, oiled pine, and garlicky sauces. Voices rose to drown the cold. Goblets clinked while minstrels supplied licentious tunes. Costumes allowed for anonymity. Masked mockery let people voice complaints in a way they could not under oath. When a queen chose to preside over a festival, sometimes she became the target for benign ridicule. She also displayed the court's capacity to absorb dissent. The invented drama of festivity often mirrored political drama. Both were staged for spectators who were also actors. From ritual to the intimate, consider the midwife, the unsung professional who knew life and death in a way ministers never would. Midwives were both practical technicians and social mediators. Their work required knowledge of herbs, hands experienced in delivery, and an ability to navigate ecclesiastical suspicion. They kept tools that were simple yet essential: linen, poultices, cords, birthing stools, and the intangible tool of presence. Apprenticeship was common, knowledge passed from woman to woman, often unwritten. That oral tradition allowed midwives to be adept at techniques that historians can only reconstruct from fragmented records. Childbirth in the medieval world was perilous. Say the word and feel the quick tightening in your chest, not because we want to sensationalize it, but because the stakes were existential. Midwives managed labor, tried to turn fetuses breech, soothed mothers with herbs and pressure, and comforted families when outcomes were poor. The Church had a complicated relationship with midwives. On the one hand, saints' cults and prayers for safe delivery were common. On the other, suspicion of secret practices and accusations of witchcraft could be mobilized when a delivery went awry. Many accusations against midwives were less about practiced malpractice and more about the broader anxieties of communities suffering infant mortality and looking for explanations. Where the record is punitive, modern historians caution that gendered fears often animated legal proceedings. Think of a small cottage. E Eunda e as instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "and legal proceedings". Think of a small cottage. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento, mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. But a midwife sits by a low fire, the smell of communicated herbs in the air, a woman groaning between contractions while relatives whisper prayers. The midwife's hands are experienced. Her language is spare and clear. She uses linen to bind, warm water to relax muscles, and calls on a network of women if the case demands additional support. The emotional cadence is intense. Pride at a safe delivery, unbearable grief at a stillbirth, and the relentless resilience that made midwives central to the reproduction of family and polity alike. Now, return to queens and the literal bedchamber, which was often the most political room in a castle. The bed is a recurring symbol for a reason. It is where dynasties are secured, where alliances are consummated, where births happen, and where reputations can be made or destroyed. Consider the bed as a stage, and the chamber as a courtroom. Confidences whispered there could decide succession. The adjacent staff, ladies-in-waiting, servants, eunuchs in some courts, were witnesses and sometimes accomplices. When a rumor about a queen's bed reached ears beyond the chamber, it transformed private dynamics into public consequences. Take, for instance, the way accusations of sexual impropriety were used. When a queen was accused of adultery, the question was not only sexual morality, but legitimacy. Adultery could delegitimize an heir, or excuse a rival faction to push for deposition. That is why legal mechanisms, trials, inquiries, witness statements were so often performative. They settled political needs as much as moral ones. Contemporary sources often record confessions that modern historians question. Confessions could be obtained under pressure, or coaxed from servants whose loyalty had shifted. Which leads us to one of the most fragile things in medieval courts:
The line between rumor and libel. Libel is the drying of rumor into something that can be repeated with authority. Pamphlets, ballads, and painted tapestries all served as media of persuasion. A ballad that accused a queen of poisoning a rival might be political propaganda dressed as entertainment. Historians remind us that such media were not neutral. They were weapons. Therefore, whenever you hear about a queen poisoned or strangled, ask, who stood to gain from that story? Now, a vignette with a sharper edge. The story around a queen accused of poisoning her husband. The chronology is important. In one known case, a king dies under murky circumstances. Rumors multiply. A queen was seen ordering a special treatment. A favorite was dismissed. The king's food tasted odd, one source claims. Later chroniclers sharpen the narrative. They supply motive, opportunity, and method. Modern historians often find the evidence thin. Poisoning is a convenient explanation when medicine was primitive and post-mortem certainties absent. The takeaway is both simple and profound. In an age of scarce forensic clarity, rumor filled the gap and settled into narrative.
The interplay between rumor and ritual defines the emotional economy of medieval life. I will close this segment with a quieter scene that synthesizes many themes. Imagine a winter night in a castle. The great hall rings with laughter, the boar's head is borne in with trumpets. But upstairs, a small chamber sits quiet and watchful. There, a midwife holds a lantern over a birthing stool. A queen's hand is clasped in the candlelight by her closest attendant. Outside, the court murmurs, and the lord of misrule drowns out the cold with his capers. Inside, the politics of succession compress into a single pressing hour. Both spaces, the noisy feast and the intimate chamber, are stages where public life and private peril meet. The queen's fate in that hour, the midwife's skill, the servants who witness or keep secrets, all will be transformed into story. That story will be told unevenly. Some parts recorded faithfully in account books, others exaggerated by ballads, and still others lost and reconstructed from rumor. When historians read such episodes, we must untangle sensory fact from partisan fiction. But we must also honor the human stakes that made rumor feel urgent. There is more to say. Specific courtroom trials where testimonies were manufactured. The story of a queen whose network of lovers and favorites made her enemies. The way festivals both mirrored and soothed social tension. And the particular craft and peril of midwifery across regions. Each of these scenes is a thread. Together, they knit the larger cloth of how power and rumor coexisted. So far, we have moved from the long shadow that rumor casts over queens to the warmth of bonfires and the hands of midwives. Next, we will look in closer detail at two dramatic court episodes that show rumor functioning like law. One involving a high-profile trial of alleged adultery, and another showing how an accusation of witchcraft or poisoning was used to displace influence. Both episodes will let us examine testimony, motive, and the way physical spaces, bedchamber, hearth, hall, turn into juridical arenas. We will also linger over a midwife's training record and a surviving inventory that lists her tools to get closer to the material culture of care, and to understand how knowledge was passed among women despite institutional pressures. Listen for the way the language of kingship shifts when rumor begins to circulate. Adjectives soften into verdicts, and private gestures become narrative evidence.
Those shifts tell us a great deal about medieval imagination and about the precariousness of queenship. The first courtroom drama opens not with a herald's trumpet, but with a torn shift and a murmuring corridor. The queen is carried, pale and steady, into the king's hall, while candles gutter. Her face is veiled, not to hide guilt, but to preserve modesty in a chamber that will be made public by speech.
Beside him, the steward, thin, dry-mouthed, clutched the roll that contained the first account of rumor, the clerk's neat brown script visible even at a distance. A physician whose hand smelled of herbs and whose gown was too fine for such an accusation leaned back against the paneling. The chaplain had his stole folded about his wrists. Two of the older women, Matilda among them, pressed close together by the hearth, watchful. When the midwife entered, they fell quiet, as if at the arrival of a small, dangerous weather. She stood in the lintel, sleeves rolled, her hair braided and bound under a linen coif, the lines of her face mapped by many nights kept at the bedside of women in travail. She carried no swagger, no pleading, only a domestic reserve that carries the shape of a life. The steward read the charge aloud, and the sound of his voice was like a pointer on a map, marking the place where rumor had become text. "It is set down," he said, "that on the third day after Lady Eleanor's confinement there came upon the child a sudden sickness. Physicians were called and herbs given, yet the child died on the fourth day. It is written in petition that you, Iselda of the Stitch and Cord, administered to the dame and to the infant, and that in your keeping were found a small phial of weed and vinegar, a charm in linen, and a knife whose edge might sever the umbilical." He looked at the Lord's face then, reading the countenance that would turn the reading into deed. "She had a name," the steward said. Under the steward's pen, the name was a pivot. The clerk who had first put the rumor to paper stood at the Lord's shoulder with waxed fingers and a look that sugared his conscience. His scrawl could be amended, enlarged, or left to harden. Around the room the household murmured. The physician pinched the bridge of his nose, and the chaplain laid a hand upon his book as if to steady it. "Is this what you ask of me?" Iselda said finally, and the sound of her voice in that bright, high place surprised some of those who had only ever heard her speak by a bedside. She did not yet plead, only asked as a woman asks for the first light to be seen. She sought to know the terms. The steward repeated the charge, slower, each syllable a small stone put into a jar. "That you did administer unwholesome things unto the lady and to the child. That you did bind a charm upon the babe. That by your craft the child was taken." Matilda made a sound at the hearth, a quick intake that might have been sympathy or consternation. Two of the younger maids crossed themselves. The physician cleared his throat. "It is not for me to say what was done," he said, "yet I saw the child. The skin was yellowed at the edges. The mouth clung to air as if it tasted bitter. There are cures for such things, and there are toxins." His fingers steepled, and he named certain symptoms in a voice that taught the room what to see. "A stranger in a gray cloak, one who came most late, was heard in the buttery, speaking of sums and of the Lord's name in towns beyond. He said, 'Every house holds its price.'" A pause settled like ash. The steward's fingers tightened on the roll. The stranger's voice, a rumor in itself, loosened the neatness of the accusation. Suddenly, the midwife's tools were not the only potential instruments. "Where is this stranger now?" asked the Lord. No one could say. Men from distant households drifted through the veil like weather. Witnesses are often as flitting. The clerk inscribed the maid's words, and in the scribe's hand, rumor narrowed once more into a line. The midwife's defense, when it came, was not a speech of law, but of work. She spoke of the cool of the cord against the new skin, of the way a mother's breath draws like a bell when the child first opens mouth to the air. She told of ointment rubbed thin as a film upon cracked nipples, of a prayer said into a woman's ear like a stitch, of the way one must sometimes press with two hands, gentle, insistent, to call the child down. She spoke of nights when a mother's body refused the shape the world would give it, and a midwife had to be firm as a bridle. She did not spare herself the truth of difficult things, the slips, the moments when no craft would sway nature. How is such truth to weigh against a charge that names malice? "Yet there is the list," the steward said. He unrolled a second sheet, one of the manor's inventories, and read aloud the items: birthing stool, 2 folded sheets, tow, small iron knife, brass bowl, threads and pins, phial of rue and vinegar, boiled rosemary, linen charm. He lifted his steward's hand and placed it across the list, as if to close a book. The chaplain frowned. The cloth charm, was it inscribed? Who is the charm for? If such charms are of a nature pagan or superstitious, then the church must speak. "Charms have their place," Matilda said at the hearth, and when she spoke, the room itself seemed to pause. Matilda had borne more children than any of them could count, and the convent had been her lifelong school. We bind a token to remind the babe of its mother. We bind to keep off envy, that terrible thing. To call it witchery is a cruelty. Her voice rode a thin last line of authority. She had, in another year, been a reader of psalms and a teacher of women. The law sometimes listened when she sighed. A clerk near the dais tapped the roll with a quill. "There must be an inquiry," he said. "The Lord will ordain it. If the Lord refers to the ecclesiastical court, then the chaplain will sit with the bishop's man. If he refers it to a secular inquest, then men sworn to oath shall sit and judge on facts." "Which will you choose?" one of the younger squires asked, for a choice would determine not simply method, but the frame of guilt. The Lord watched the midwife, then the physician, then the list, as if the fate of his household were a board of petty weights. "Both," he said at last. "The matter concerns kin. Let it be gathered here by the steward, and also sent in petition to the bishop's court. Let witnesses be sworn. Let the child's bones be shown. Let the midwife's things be searched." Someone in the hall breathed a quick prayer at this pronouncement, as if the lifting of doubt were certain when word went outward. But the midwife's hands, folded now upon her linen bag, trembled only a little. It was not fear of death that read upon her face, nor terror of pain. It was the wear of a life that had learned the limits of its language. She had soothed women when sons were scarce, and had cut cords by the small iron herself. She thought of the nights in which she had pressed against shoulders, and felt the bones of women and the first pulses of babes. How much did a life's craft weigh against the single word poison? When the steward ordered that her possessions be kept under guard, and that she be lodged for the night in the solar, there was an outcry from some, and a relief from others.
The steward's phrase, lodged in the solar, was a gentle way of saying that she would not be confined in the most brutal sense. The manor did not have a jail like the town, and the lord had some sense that a scandal handled too harshly would stain the house's name. Yet containment, even gentle, carries its own accusation. To be set apart is already a kind of sentence. Iselda was led past the buttery and through the lesser chambers, past the great tapestry where the hunt was woven, and the worn chair that had once been the seat of a man who now lay far from them. The midwife's neighbors looked from behind curtains, some with sympathy, some with a new, wary distance. The kitchen boys muttered, and the hounds at the back kennel rose with a low murmur. She felt the weight of many eyes like a strap across her shoulders. In the solar she was given a pallet and an ewer of water. A maid handed her a bowl. Matilda came a little while after with a small, crusted loaf. "You must keep your wits," Matilda told her. "A woman is least when she becomes an object upon which men turn their weights. Remember names, remember faces, keep your tongue. The clerk will bring his queries in the morning." Night settled beyond the glassless windows. In the corridor a wind moved like a thin hand, and the sound of the great house at work, doors closing, the lazily slamming of a shutter, went on. Iselda knelt by her pallet and opened the linen bag. Inside lay, as the inventory had said, the small charm, a scrap of linen wrapped thrice about a worn coin and stitched with red thread, and the phial, corked with pitch, the oil around its neck dried and dark. She touched each item with the gentleness of one who tends cloth, thinking of how often a charm had been nothing more than a placeholder for courage, how often a phial had borne nothing more lethal than the bitter tincture of an herb. She thought of Lady Eleanor and the strength the woman had shown in delivery, the way her hands had clutched the bed-rail when the child emerged. She thought of the child's face, small and strange in that last hour, its skin drawn, its mouth closed. And she thought of how many times she had washed mud from infants' knuckles and tied cords with hands that did not tremble. The mind of a midwife is full of remembering. Each birth lays in memory like a bead upon a string. One bead shone now with a dull, accusing light. In the morning the clerk came with his quill and a list of questions. He had the look of a man who delights at order. "You will tell me, mistress," he said, "who else tended Lady Eleanor within these days? Who visited the chamber? Who brought any relics or remedies?" Iselda named names, maids and matrons, the lord's physician, the wet nurse, the stranger in a grey cloak who may have butted into the buttery. Each name the clerk set down like a tally, each tally a route for rumor to take into the wide world. Outside the chapel the bells began to toll again, not for mass, but for the gathering that would determine whether rumor hardened into judgment. Men mounted horses, riders whose faces were known in other vales, and scribes loaded their slates. The steward sent messages to the bishop's man. A palfrey took the road toward the episcopal town with a sealed letter. Iselda, left in her small chamber, felt the house rearrange itself around a possible verdict. She paced once, 3 times, counting the boards, and then held the charm again, searching for some sign that would prove the thing innocent or guilty. Superstition has the curious property of telling its bearer nothing, while the law, conversely, will look for evidence until it has nothing left but the tangle of fact and fear. When the physician returned that afternoon, he carried in his hand a small wooden box. Within, wrapped in linen, was the infant's body. For a midwife, the sight of a dead child is as eloquent as a sermon, and as grievous. Iselda watched as he drew aside the linen and set the tiny face exposed. The physician's manner had the practiced reserve of a man who has read many books and knows how to make the body speak. "We will examine," he said, and he began to speak in his learned way of poisons and of natural causes. He pricked the child's fingernail to watch the blood bead. He lifted the eyes to the light. He smelled for the sharp notes that the stingers of certain herbs leave upon breath. He spoke of bilious humors and of dropsy and of internal faults. He also spoke, quietly, of things that could be slipped into milk or into the mouth in a night of confusion, how vinegar and oil could hide the taste of other things. "Did you at any time give any potion unseen to the mother?" he asked Iselda. The physician's question, a surgeon's probe. "No," she said. "If I gave anything, I set it on the table and called for the wet nurse to take from it if need be."
Eu não feed secrets a babes. He looked at her then as a man might look at a tool that has not failed him. "Then the matter will be not of craft, but of luck," he muttered. "If no foreign matter can be found in the child's mouth, if no trace of poison can be uncovered, then what shall the court do but accept nature?" That night the house was filled with whisperings of counsel. The steward argued for a swift, secular examination. The chaplain urged deference to ecclesiastical wisdom. The Lord sat alone for some time, hands upon his knees, weighing an heir against the stain of an accusation. Outside, in the lesser lanes, men began to speak openly, some in pity, some in malice, about the midwife who kept charms, and about the stranger in the grey cloak who had chewed his words of profit much too loudly. Iselda lay awake and thought of the registry chest at the convent, the neat folio of names and measures of grain. She thought of Iselda, bound to Matilda, attended 23 births, the example that now felt like a child's story told for another life. She saw all the hands that had taught her, a convent's stern fingers, the old midwife's patient clasping, the rough laugh of a mother who had plucked her babe to her breast and cried because she could. She had lived by touch and by the muscle memory of aid. Now those hands would be parsed and read. She imagined a scribe's quill scratching a different sentence under each joint of her fingers. The next day the house filled with men in leather and chain. They came as men who bring law. Some were known, others were strangers, their faces browned by other courts. The clerk unrolled yet another sheet, the Inquisition writ, and the steward called the first witnesses. The solar emptied of its hush. Corridors took on the cadence of interrogation. Iselda found herself led by 2 yeomen through the hall toward the dais, the little linen bag tight in her fist. At the foot of the dais, the physician laid his findings upon the table. The child's body, examined and sealed. A slip of paper with his notes bound in twine. The notes were quiet and careful, but the hand that translates observation into counsel is not the same as the hand that translates counsel into accusation. "These are my findings," he said. "I find no foreign marks upon the child's flesh. I find no sign of forced ingress, no broken vowels of wound. The body is small and weak. The mother, as was shown, labored long. Such weakness, one cannot say it is an act of malice. He did not raise his head to the midwife. If there be poison, it was a cunning thing, and left no stain. Therefore the matter rests upon witness." Witness after witness spoke, and the clerk wrote them down. The wet nurse told of the midwife's measured ministrations.
The maid told of a stranger. Matilda gave a deposition on the nature of charms. A courtier who had dined in the buttery on the night the stranger was there swore that he had heard talk of coin. Each narrative shifted the burden a little, one way, then another. The clerk's hand flew. When the yeoman at last brought before them the stranger, had they found him? He was not the gray figure from the buttery, but a shadow of rumor, a traveler who claimed no memory of Lady Eleanor, and yet who had been seen in the market days before. He called himself Orin, and spoke with the slow candor of a man unaccustomed to such scrutiny. He denied having had dealings with the Lord's affairs beyond a passing trade. He denied taking any part in the child's end. The room, thickened with so many testimonies, arrived at no single truth. What gathered instead were threads, each thin and taut, that could be wove into a net. Some would weave a rope. At the end of the day, the Lord made his decision. There would be a formal inquest held in the name of his house, and the matter would be placed before the bishop with all haste. Iselda was to remain in the manor's charge, though she was not yet to be bound in irons. The steward's manor had an economy to it, an insistence that would allow the Lord to keep the matter close while outwardly appearing to seek justice. Iselda bowed when the steward spoke. She felt no triumph. The house turned once more to its commerce. The butler called for wine. The kitchen set meat to spit. But in the midwife's mind, the gear of rumor had altered. The scrolls would now carry the tilt of testimony from manor to bishopric, and a clerk somewhere would make the final sentence into ink. She thought of the inventory chest again, and the list whose lines could be read either as tools or as instruments. The same objects would be set before others: sealed file, the knife, the stitched charm, and in other hands they would be read only as accusation. That night, when the house was hushed, and the moon made the great hall's banners into ghosts, Iselda sat by the window and watched the park and the barrier of trees. Her hands were empty now. She had placed the charm and the file together upon the sill. She felt the small animal of dread within her chest, a living thing that ate time. The law would take its course, she knew, and laws are not only instruments of justice, but also the means by which a house keeps its story straight. Beyond the park, someone laughed, a young man courting a servant perhaps, and the sound lived for a single bright instant before the trees swallowed it. Iselda's thoughts wandered to the convent chest and the ledger of names. She thought of how the hand of a scribe binds a life as though that life were merely another line. She had given her life to the moment when a body crosses the threshold of the world. Now she must live through the moment when the world crosses back upon her. The thought was a cold thing, simple and necessary. When dawn came, the steward ordered that no one leave the manor without leave, and that messengers go to the neighboring houses to swear witnesses.